Everybody fake laughter now. Good one. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of The Mentionables. Although not measurably more special than any other episode of The Mentionables. I'm Joel Furchess.
I'm Caleb Johnston.
And I'm Marc Lambert.
Mark is sort of, kind of, but not really a first-time voice on this podcast. Not for lack of trying, right, Mark?
Yeah, I was very glad to have almost been on one time before.
Yeah. Anyone who follows The Mentionables will be very familiar with Mark. He's written a book with us, participated in all of our YouTube projects, sometimes solo, and most recently hosted a conference for us. Mark is a pastor and has his own podcast and apologetics ministry. Mark, tell the listeners something about yourself, and maybe this time it will take.
Something about myself, anything in particular, like ministry apologetics related? Is that what we're aiming for?
Well, this is that kind of podcast, but, you know.
Okay, then that's what I'll
anything
go
impressive, you know.
with. Anything impressive.
Yeah.
Wow, okay. No, pastor at a Baptist church in Central Texas. I have a ministry interwoven with that is just focused on answering questions. I got my start in college ministry, and on college campus, that's virtually all you do is to have conversations with skeptics and answer people's questions and doubts. And so that has just kind of shaped how I do ministry, and so here I am.
Answering questions is all that The Mentionables end up being about.
There you go. My website is heypastor.org. The idea being that you want to ask a pastor something, hey pastor, and ask your question. And so there it is.
Do your congregants raise the hand in the middle of your sermons?
Occasionally, we tend to, a worship service isn't meant to be that sort of event, but we're laid back. We roll with it.
Yeah, I've often been tempted to raise my hand in the middle of a service, but I resist the temptation.
I would rather have someone raise their hand and ask a question than to not voice a question that they have.
Yeah, see, I probably wouldn't be asking a question. Maybe, making an observation or sharing an insight or possibly disagreeing.
Usually not, probably not the best thing to disagree with the pastor during the sermon, but I'm perfectly fine to be pulled aside later. Let's not stop the flow of the worship service.
Well, I'm still campaigning to do teaching at my church, and I don't think that would help.
Probably not.
I really wish I'd had this advice, maybe 10 years ago.
You live, you learn, right? Anyway, today on The Mentionables, we talk about how humble we are. We are the humblest. So much humility, you wouldn't believe it. Also, ever want to talk to somebody about this God guy, but too old-fashioned to do so? We'll fix that, boy. Finally, how do you feel? Seriously, we'll tell you. But first, it's time for Love Song, Worship Song.
Is it a love song? Is it a worship song?
Woohoo!
Mark, first time. You nervous?
Not at all.
Okay. All right. First song. Here are the lyrics. For all those times that you stood by me, for all the truth that you made me see, for all the joy you brought to my life, for all the wrong that you made right, for every dream you made come true, for all the love I found in you, I'll be forever thankful. You're the one who held me up, never let me fall. You're the one who saw me through it all. You were my strength when I was weak. You were my voice when I couldn't speak. You were my eyes when I couldn't see. You saw the best there was in me. Lifted me up when I couldn't reach. You gave me faith because you believed. I'm everything I am because you love me. You gave me wings and made me fly. You touched my hand, I could touch the sky. I lost my faith, you gave it back to me. You said no star was out of reach. You stood by me, and I stood tall. I had your love, I had it all. I'm grateful for each day you gave me. Maybe I don't know that much, but I know this much is true. I was blessed because I was loved by you. All right, Caleb, what do you think?
Man, I went back and forth 3 or 4 times there during you giving the lyrics. I'm going to go love song.
Okay, Mark, agree or disagree?
I'm going to agree. Part sounded very familiar, and I'm not thinking it was worship, so love song.
Okay, that is correct.
A love song. A love song.
The song was Because You Love Me by Celine Dion.
Ah, okay.
All right. Next song, here are the lyrics. Feels like I'm standing in a timeless dream of light mists of pale amber rose. Feels like I'm lost in a deep cloud of heavenly scent. Touching, discovering you. I love you always forever. Near and far, closer together. Everywhere I will be with you. Everything I will do for you. I love you always forever. Near and far, closer together. Everything I will be with you. Everything I will do for you. Those are the lyrics.
That's a love song.
Caleb, you agree?
That's
Yeah, I agree with that.
Oh, it was late
sounds familiar.
90s. What's the name of that band? They were a one-hit wonder. Yeah, there's a line in there, something about chicken chair.
Yeah.
Yep.
Donna Lewis, I love you always forever.
Yes, that was like her one big hit, and then she did like a duet with Richard Marx, and it like went nowhere. I don't even remember that song at all.
Bad pick, I suppose. I should
Nice,
go
Mark.
deeper back into the 70s or something.
What else you got?
All right, next one. I want to sit at your feet, drink from the cup in your hand, lay back against you and breathe. Feel your heart beat. This love is so deep. It's more than I can stand. I melt in your peace. It's overwhelming. The more I seek you, the more I find you. The more I find you, the more I love you. That is all.
I'm going to go worship on that one.
Mark?
Sadly, as much as it would pain me to accept it if it were, that's probably the way to go.
Okay, so we both say worship, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, you are correct. The More I Seek You by Gateway Worship.
Oh, hadn't heard of them.
Yeah. Last song. Maybe I could run, maybe I could fly to you. Do you feel the same? When all you see is blame in me? And the wonder of it all is I'm living just to fall more in love with you. I want to go deeper, but is that just a stupid whim? I want to run faster, but this old leg won't carry me. I want to be deeper in love with you. Okay, there's the lyrics.
I'm going to go with Loves.
Caleb?
You know, I don't know on this one. I'm going to go worship.
Okay, and the winner is... Caleb! It was a worship song. Titled Deeper by Delirious.
Could you really consider songs by Delirious as worship songs?
Well, this one was.
I didn't really think of them as a worship band, but okay.
All right, well, it was listed.
You're the host,
as a
you're the
worship
expert.
song, and I left
You're
out
the
lyrics
expert.
that would have made it more clear that it was a worship song. So I'm pretty sure it was a worship song.
Take your word for
Fair
it.
enough.
Okay. All right, so today I think that the new guy should go first. Mark, can you start us off with your topic?
I suppose I can. My topic is, as I like to title things, is thinking with your feelings. This is something that, especially lately, in some conversations I've had, have just really been, I don't want to say getting under my skin or whatever, but it's something that's just been, it's been weighing on my heart. There, I'll use the religious language. Basically, a lot of the so-called arguments that I will encounter are empty of like any kind of rational, logical means by which they're trying to support things. You guys, as well as I, you interact with people online, you have these conversations, and the things that are being presented aren't being supported with evidence or reason. So often it's based in little more than feelings. And that's something that apologetically it struck me, but then I also just started noticing it in everything. And even as I started to think back to my time as a youth minister, it was just everything just seems to be so much over the top with feelings-based reasoning, for lack of a better way to put it, that people are thinking with their feelings. They're coming to their conclusions based on feelings. And I mean, I don't want to sit here and sound like, Spock or something. I'm not trying to say feelings are bad. They definitely have their purpose. God gave them to us for a reason. However, they should not be definitive, right? They shouldn't be the thing that controls our positions and thoughts and decisions. We're both emotional, but we're also rational. God gave us that ability to think. Right? If we're all logic, obviously we can make immoral decisions. Right? Hello, Thanos, anybody? Let's wipe out half the universe.
I am inevitable.
That
how many
seemed like
books?
a pretty rational decision.
Right. Only so many resources. Hey, get rid of the people. We got plenty of resources.
Yeah,
there you go.
Who would end up intentionally killing people for the good of everybody if they were using their rationality, right?
Well, how many movies, books, whatever, sci-fi have had the plot line of some emotionless artificial intelligence that decides the logical solution is to get rid of mankind?
56.
Where 56, probably so.
That's pretty close, Joe.
Yeah, pretty close. Right, but so you can kind of get this thing where it's like, okay, we need to put something else in there. As much as it bugs me whenever people argue moral issues off of empathy, we do need to have empathy, compassion, that sort of thing in the mix, right? But if we're all emotion, we run to the other side and we get in this other ditch where we end up bad things can happen. As I said, I spent many years in youth and college ministry, and having myself been young once upon a time, I'm very much aware of the emotionally driven moments when a young adult is in love. And it doesn't matter that the guy or the girl that they're head over heels for is toxic and nothing that you should want in a relationship, right? They just know it's meant to be because they're in love.
Hey, when God tells you to marry somebody, you better marry that person.
Now, that's true. But that better be a burning bush or an audible voice from heaven or something. But, it's just being driven by emotion. The emotion of envy or the emotion of vengeance. They just see so often, oh, no, can't let that stand. I have to pay them back. Why? Because, right? There's nothing more to it than feeling. It just feels right. Having done some marriage counseling and things like that as a pastor, you dig in and you do these studies and you read things about, why do people get divorced? Why don't marriages last? And a lot of the things that people will say is just, well, we're not in love anymore. Well, so? That it's not feelings based, right? People making decisions based on feelings has done a ton of damage and just wreckage in people's lives. I'll own up to one of my own. When I was a young adult and bought into some of this stuff, there was a young lady. We were getting serious in our relationship. Marriage was even being talked about, but we were hitting a little bit of a slump in situation, and she said something along the lines of, I just couldn't imagine my life without you. And I thought, I can imagine mine without her. And I'm meaning that like, it was just like, I just self-reflective, emotional thing, or it was like, yeah, I mean, if something happened, I could move on. It wouldn't crush me. And I said, that shouldn't be the way it is. We have to end this. And now being older, looking back, and now having been married, this weekend, tomorrow will be my 16th anniversary with my wife. And thank you. Found someone willing to put up with me for that long. And so, but it has ups and downs. It is a miracle. Praise God. But if you're just guided by your emotions, man, there's plenty of times that if it was just emotion, this thing would have been over. But you hang in there because it's commitment, right? That there's more going on than just, hey, what do I feel and react? And so, I don't know if you guys wanted to jump in on any comments on that, but
yeah, Mark, I think that's one of the greatest misconceptions about the kind of Disney version of love we see today. It's all about feelings and emotions. When I'm having conversations with people and we turn to the topic of love, it's all about that choice. Love is a choice. It's not merely an emotion or a feeling. Love is actually making a choice to do something in the better interest of somebody else, even when you don't feel like it. And I think people have a hard time rationalizing that's actually what it is, because it's not this overarching romantic, beautiful idea make it out to be.
Yeah.
But when you can make a choice to do something outside of yourself.
Absolutely. I remember as a single guy with a view towards one day, the pastor was leading a class that was how to have a successful marriage, and I thought, well, hey, one day I'll have a marriage, but I can't go to the class because it's for married couples only. So I actually sat outside the door in the hallway, listening in and taking notes.
So you audited the class.
I audited the class, and one of the first things he said was, "We are not here to talk about love." He said, "You ask 10 people how to define that word, you'll get 10 different definitions. We're talking about marriage. We're here to talk about commitment." And that's how he started the class. And I was like, yes, rock on, write that down. But in other things, kind of shifting, because we're in a apologetics podcast, one thing that comes up often, you'll have moral arguments and that kind of stuff, is the idea of objective morality and it being grounded in God, and it needs to have this transcendent source. And people say, "Oh, no, empathy. Empathy is where we get morality." But that completely fails. It completely fails if that's where we're getting our morality from, because in any situation, in any moral situation, there's going to be multiple people involved. Who are you empathizing with? People say on the abortion issue, well, you empathize with the mother. Don't you worry about what she's going through. Okay, what about empathizing with the child? It's going to lose their life. Who do you empathize with? Right?
Mark,
you can't really
with the veil of ignorance.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that would be how you determine who to empathize with.
Well, but here's what you just did. You just entered rationality into it. So you're not actually being guided by the feeling anymore.
I was only being pseudo-serious.
Well, what's funny is if you get in a situation where you can actually peel back you have that emotion, I have this emotion, then all of a sudden they start appealing to argument. It's like, okay, well, then let's just get straight to the argument and skip the feelings thing. And let's talk about what is actually true, not just how we feel about it. But alas, often feelings guides people much too much, I would say.
I'll jump in really quick. I mentioned the veil of ignorance, so for the listener's sake, I think it's worth explaining that to them briefly. This is a scenario wherein you take all of the parties involved in a situation, and then you make a choice based on you don't know which of those parties you would be, so you don't know who to empathize with. So that allows you to prioritize who has the biggest stake in the issue. So I mean, abortion. You're in a situation where you're, say, a pro-lifer, a pro-choicer, the doctor, the mother, or the baby. And then you ask the question, should you kill the baby? Well, who is most impacted by that? If you could be any one of those, you don't know which one you're going to be in this scenario. In my measurement, via the veil of ignorance, you shouldn't kill the baby because, there's the chance that I might be the baby in this situation, and they get the raw end of the deal.
Yeah, that would seem just fairly obvious to me. But see, that's one of the things where it becomes a little, there's no objective standard to judge that by, because someone else can have other reasons they may think, oh no, it's the other party that you should. And that doesn't actually seem to set any kind of real objective standard. And so therefore, I would say fails as a definitive way to get your morality.
Yeah, I'm not endorsing the veil of ignorance. I was just explaining it. Right.
Yeah. But so often, we get in these conversations and different things. I have seen personally, let me just give a couple of examples where I've seen in the church, in conversations with Christians and in conversations with unbelievers, where this feelings-based motivation has just caused problems. There was one point where I had a couple of youth who were just highly active in everything that was going on in the youth group. And I finally got them to start coming on Sunday mornings, because teenagers don't go to church on Sunday mornings. But they started coming. It went 2, maybe 3 weeks, and then they vanish. And not just from Sunday mornings. They're just gone. Like, they're not even like returning my texts or calls or anything. I'm thinking, what is going on here? And I run into them at the store. I'm like, hey guys, I've been missing you. What's going on? What are you up to? And they said, oh, well, last time we were there, the pastor said, and I don't even remember what it was, and we just can't go to a church if that's the kind of thing being taught. And I stopped and I thought, what are you talking about? He didn't say that. And they said something, and it clicked, and it hit me. Oh, wait a minute. They don't understand. I know the guy. He's a friend. I understand the background of the comment he made, but they immediately was just, I'm offended, leave the church. And then as soon as it's like, okay, let me explain, and once kind of the rationality kicked in and they understood, it was like, oh, okay. And then they came back and everything was fine. But the emotion driven led them to anger and to leave the church, whereas pausing, giving some rationality and thinking in there, cleared up the situation, everything's good, moving on, coming back to church. And I don't know how often I as a pastor try to have an open door policy. If you think I've said something wrong, if I've offended you in some way, because I'm only human. If you think a teaching I said was wrong, if you think that whatever it was, come tell me. Don't just get mad and let that emotion guide you in it. Let's come talk. And so I've seen several other instances where emotions has been toxic, or emotion-led action has been toxic in congregations. Another example, conversation I was having with a non-believer, talking about how they were arguing that Christianity's teachings on sexuality breeds an environment for sexual abuse and cover-up. This was a couple months ago. You had the Catholic thing in Pennsylvania, and then you had the studies on the Southern Baptist that came out, and so it was kind of all everybody was talking about for a few days. And the reasoning that she gave for why Christian doctrine would be toxic, the doctrine on sexuality would breed this environment for abuse, was her experience. Well, the things that they taught and the way people acted in the church I grew up in, that's how it is. That was my experience, my subjective experience leads me to feel this way about it, was their argument. And their church's teaching was just bad, unbiblical doctrine. They were not behaved Christ-like. And when you tried to bring some, okay, here's some understanding, here's some rationality, here's some reason injected into that thought process, their reaction was just, who are you to question my experience?
Yeah, so this reminds me of a conversation I had not too long ago. And the gist of the conversation was that this woman had a bad church experience, right? And so she had come to the conclusion that God didn't exist based on this experience. And so I decided to ask her, have you heard of UFO cults? And she hadn't, but she quickly got the idea. And I said, okay, so these cults, they say that they're in touch with extraterrestrials, and, the extraterrestrials have these plans in mind for the human race and so forth. And I was like, now, what is the likelihood in your mind that they're actually in touch with extraterrestrials? And, she was unconvinced by that. And I was like, okay, so basically here you have a church that thinks they're in touch with extraterrestrials, but they're not. Does that mean extraterrestrials do not exist? Can you jump to that conclusion based on what this church is saying and doing? And she then her next response was, well, you can't judge me. You don't know my experience. I was like, okay, justification is for thoughts and deeds. You made a statement that God doesn't exist. That's either true or false. That's a truth statement, not something that you justify based on experience. And that pretty much ended the conversation right there.
Yeah. Often whenever I think whenever people are that is their motivation, is the feelings, is I don't know if it's a defense mechanism because for whatever reason, but they're going to withdraw, they're going to push back whenever the reason comes in. And the crazy thing is, because I mean, like I said, I don't want to sit here and sound like I'm arguing that we all need to be like Spock or something. Unless it's Spock from like the remake, because he actually had some attitude in there. We need to allow our emotions to inform us about the world around us, right? God gave them to us for a reason, right? Whenever you're happy, it's telling you something about the experience you're having. Whenever you're scared, it's telling you something. It's a red flag saying, uh-oh, danger, something's going on here. And it's there for a reason, and we need to let it inform us, but we also have to temper that with reason. An example that I will often use, because I have little kids, so of course I draw examples from them. Whenever my 4-year-old daughter
Unlike
is
most
scared,
pastors.
Right, because no pastors ever draw examples from their family. Right, but whenever my child is scared because the monster they saw in their room, there's two different things that have to get dealt with there. One is she's scared. She needs comforted. Okay, that's where I need the feelings of compassion and empathy to guide me, to hug her and to hold her and tell her it's going to be okay. But at some point in that conversation, you got to flip the lights on and show her, look, there's no monster. It's just the light casting shadows on the toys in the corner. See, look, off, on. No monster there. It's okay, right? At some point, you have to teach the kid there's no monster in the room. The fear that you're feeling isn't valid. There's nothing there to actually be scared of. And you need to interject that rationality. And that's kind of a simple example that I think a lot of people could be like, okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. We'll take that same paradigm and go put it into other situations where you're being guided by your feelings. Just because you feel it doesn't mean it's wrong, but it also doesn't mean it's right. And you stop, back up, look at it, interject some reason, and see what is actually going on. In the issue of apologetics, and this might be where I need you guys to jump in and help me think this one through, because I was thinking, okay, well, this is all true and right and good, but what do we do with it in apologetics as we're addressing the issues? In conversation, sometimes you can just be walking already into a no-win setup, right? Whenever you're coming with, as apologetics usually focuses on, the argument and the logic and the reasoning and the evidence and that sort of thing, and the other person's just primarily emotion. That conversation's not going anywhere. And it's one of those kind of things where it's like, okay, and maybe this is, like I said, where you guys can help me think through this part of it. Now knowing this, emotion's good to a point, but we need reasoning to step in there. What do we do whenever we step into that conversation, and here we are armed with apologetics, and they're coming at it with emotion?
Well, in my study that I started on memes, the study ended with this observation that people feel before they think. So feelings always precede thought. And this is why memes are so popular now, because if you sit down and you give a rational argument, that's going to go over people's head, or they're not going to stay reading the thread long enough to read the entire argument. But if you throw up a funny picture and a couple of words, that enters their mind, they have that emotional reaction, and that cements the whole thing. So apologetically, well, this is the reason that the argument from evil is so popular, because you could sit there and dismantle the argument from evil, and then your opponent can get up and just relate an instance of evil. This kid was raped by her father. Okay? and God's going to justify that. Every argument you just made goes out the window because there's tremendous feeling that comes with that example. And, the audience has forgotten everything you said because suddenly something really horrific has entered their mind, and boom, argument over, you lost. So apologetically, what do? We have to deal with the feeling before we make the argument. And this is the way that, counseling works as well. First, you deal with the feelings. You make them aware that you understand what they're feeling, that their feelings are valid, that they feel what they feel, and that's real. And then once you've given that empathy, sorry to throw that word around, Mark, but once you've provided that and they feel as if you understand them, then they're going to be open to listening to things you have to say. So a person needs to be heard before they will hear.
Yeah, y'all are totally stealing my segment at this point, but that's exactly it, Joel. I think in order to be heard, like you said, you have to actually listen first, and I think that's what we have to do to sidestep these kind of emotional issues that really do catch people off guard in a way that solidifies their view quicker than most rational arguments could. And so I personally use questions to flesh that emotion out, see where it came from, see what personal experiences led to it, see why, a certain statement or, meme or meme thought has, impacted their view as much as it has. And so I utilize questions to kind of flesh that out. I really listen to what they say and then use that to dig deeper and understand where they're actually coming from. And then, sometimes I get the opportunity to share my own perspective. Other times I just get the opportunity to help them explore an area of thought they may be struggling with.
Mark, are you okay if Caleb slides into a section right now?
I wanted to add one more thought.
Okay.
As I was listening, it occurs to me the bulk of what I do is a teaching environment, let's say conversational environment. And as I was, just thinking, whenever I'm preaching, that I'm expositing the scripture, but I'm also having to try to communicate in such a way that it's not just cold information, but that it's also touching people in that sort of way that they're also provoked emotionally. I'm reaching them on that, and I wonder if there's a way in apologetics that we can do that as well. Right now, one of the biggest kind of growing things for atheism is street epistemology, and they just completely bypass, any rationality and evidential based argument, and they're, they go straight at the loaded questions and tug on the heartstrings and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying be manipulative, but I think
Pine Hill cough.
I wasn't going to name names, but yeah, there is something to be learned there. Is that we do need to be able to engage on that level. There's so much of what we do, though, is just addressing evidence and argument and information. Not even really sure how to bridge that. So, just thinking out loud at this point.
A couple of things. The first is if we can turn more Christians into apologists, instead of having a few people hog the limelight, if we can get the bulk of the church body capable of defending themselves, then we've got a large group of people able to go out, form relationships, interact with people. Therefore, it's not this cold rationality, distant argumentation thing anymore. It's something that individuals are, within the context of a close relationship and friendship, bringing to other people. That it deals with the feelings, before you bring in the arguments, because feelings have to come first.
Well, Joel, you just described my segment there, but before diving into it, because that's exactly what I'm touching on, is how we practically apply this. I think it may wrap things up a little bit better. So would you like to kind of dive in and give us your topic for tonight first?
All right, I can do that. This actually intersects well with Mark's topic as well. All right, so today I want to talk about intellectual humility. But before I go into that, I want to talk about a problem. If you follow the Mentionables at all, you've heard me talk about the study that I'm doing with Christians who deconvert, meaning they become atheists. There are a number of really interesting patterns and trends I'm running into in this study, and I will talk about those in the future when I've published my research, which probably isn't going to be for a while, given the current pace. But today I want to talk about one in particular that I hadn't anticipated when I headed into the study. There's a lot of trends that I'm seeing that I'm not surprised at, but this one, I hadn't anticipated seeing it, and how common it is. But I guess once I think back on it, it's not real surprising. It's not like they didn't like the church's wallpaper, so they became an atheist or something like that. Anyway, I'll illustrate this by talking about Michael Shermer's deconversion. You guys know about Michael Shermer?
Know of him. Not sure about the deconversion story, though.
So basically, Shermer is an atheist psychologist, and he publishes Skeptic magazine and a lot of books about how our belief in God is just the human brain's proclivity towards pattern-seeking behavior and so forth. And he travels and talks and debates on the subject of atheism. So in short, he's an outspoken, dyed-in-the-wool atheism popularizer. But he actually started out really, really darn Christian to begin with. So he describes his deconversion. He talks about this attitude of unyielding and total certainty within the Christian community. He got his degree in psychology, but he got it at a Christian university. So he was involved in a Christian community at the university, and he was a Christian before entering university, as you would be if you're going to go to a Christian university. But at any rate, he says one of the things that put him off was how he discovered that when drawing data together in psychological research, you have to begin from a neutral standpoint. And the amount of data you need to gather to even approach something like certainty is exhaustive. And even then, you can't be certain about things, even with all the peer reviews and corroborating data and so forth. And yet, with no data whatsoever, Christians seem so dogmatically certain about things. And I encounter this a lot when I interact with atheists. They come out of the gate with this accusation that Christians think they have the market cornered on truth with a capital T. And the profile of these kinds of atheists seems to be pretty close to Shermer. You know, they started out in a Christian background, and now they're heavily committed to science as their worldview. And they're pretty offended by this attitude of total certainty that Christians seem to have. And I get where they're coming from. I came out of a pretty dogmatic background myself. Before I go into my background, though, what are you guys' thoughts on this idea that Christians have this sort of dogmatic certainty about their worldview?
I think it varies. I don't think you can actually paint with a broad brush. Because I know people who look at the evidence, they look at the arguments, and they say, well, this seems most probably true. It makes the most sense. That's what I'm going to follow. I know people who, they know Jesus, and they look at the arguments, and they go, well, okay, maybe those don't add up to total certainty, but I believe Jesus because he saved me. And then you have people, probably I'm one of them, that are more towards the, this is the way it is, and the idea that it wouldn't be is ridiculous. I'm about as close to certain about Christianity as I could be about anything. And so, but I think there's a spectrum of the way people view Christianity, even among Christians, as far as certainty goes.
Well, so the church I grew up in, and I mean since I was a baby until about the age of 11, you get this sort of thing where they would get up in the pulpit and they would say, alcohol is evil, and that was the bottom line. They would assert it. Maybe they'd bring a scripture in, but it was pretty much just alcohol is evil, and that's, the bottom line. And this sort of, there were no arguments given. It was an assertion. And same thing with
Baptist. Baptist.
Hey now, watch it.
We're going to have a denomination off.
Oh, I'm a Baptist too right now, technically. So,
well, the church I grew up in was Evangelical Methodist, whatever that means.
They're Baptists, but they like to dance.
Yeah,
that sounds about right.
Yeah.
No, dancing was evil too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Out.
And sex was evil because it might lead to dancing. So. At any rate, you get the idea. So here I am in this church, and the church had a Christian school that was, part of the church. And so I'm in this Christian school. I'm in this particular church. And I, ended up going to church elsewhere when I was about 11 at a place that was a little less dogmatic about things. But I continued in that school until my senior year. And after that, I went to a Christian college. But the college was a far cry from the school. I mean, for lack of better words, I'd say that the school was fundamentalist, and I mean that in the derisive way. Apologies, Mark.
That's okay. I'll forgive you.
Okay. And the college
Jesus
was
commands
more,
me to.
The college was more what you might call liberal. So, for instance, in high school, I had this teacher that was so committed to this idea that the name on the book of the Bible was the guy that wrote it. Bottom line. That was gospel truth. So, we would bring up this, Samuel dies about halfway through 1 Samuel, and then he's not in 2 Samuel at all. So he can't be the author of both books, right? And my teacher's like, no, he's the author of both books. He just did the rest prophetically before he died. Like, okay. Well, Moses...
Wow.
Deuteronomy records Moses' death. Yeah, he wrote about that prophetically. That was the guy's get out of the...
I'm a fundamentalist, so I'm going to call shenanigans on that one.
So anyway, that was my high school. Then I went to college, and in my first year, they made us take Old Testament, and there I was being taught about the documentary hypothesis right out of the gate. So you could see the system shock that might have occurred in between those two. Everybody knows the documentary hypothesis, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, I was a pretty outspoken guy, so I ended up arguing with my professor right there in the classroom, which did not make my peers look kindly upon me. But
typically that doesn't work out well.
Yeah. He had no problem, entertaining the arguments, though.
Yeah, you know what's really sad? Let me rabbit trail for just a second while you gave me a great place to get up on a soapbox. My experience is most people in school are just there to get through it. Yeah. And that has just always bugged me so much because it's a place to learn. And whenever, you're engaging with the professor, even if, they're being, nice about it or a jerk about it or whatever, and everyone else is just like, oh, get on with it. Is this going to be on the test? And it's like, guys, you're here to learn. I mean, you're actually paying some money for these people to teach you. Learn. And no, that's been my experience. That people are just, I'm here to get through. Don't make waves.
It was probably a combination of that and me being a dogmatic fundamentalist in class, which caused the eyes to roll.
Yeah, I'm right there with Mark on this one. So many people just want to skate by, and I was kind of there with you too, Joel, in that my first ethics class in college, the final assignment, I got a straight F on because I attacked each of the ethical views that had been presented in class I was supposed to present on, and said these don't hold up because of X, Y, Z, and had to go back and dumb it down to a level that laid things out in a way where it didn't attack the professor so much in order to even pass the class.
Yep. Well, there you go. So yeah, I remember in the final paper I had for Old Testament, I had to outline the documentary hypothesis and, all the things that we'd been taught that I didn't agree with. And so I remember ending it with an impassioned spiel on how, given the choice between rejecting what the Bible said and being wrong or accepting what it said and being wrong, I would hedge my bets and accept it. And, the professor was polite enough to not make a deal out of that. But this was kind of the attitude that I retained straight into my apologetics career. I was a hardcore inerrantist and young earth creationist and so on. But I quickly found that when you're having a discussion, argument, with an atheist, if you try to defend inerrancy or creationism on the spot, they're just going to skip whatever issue you're talking about, and then they spend all their time attacking those two subjects. So they don't have to deal with what the issue you're trying to bring to bear, because they know they should just pound you over the head with Bible contradictions and science.
Let me interject here. I don't know if you were baiting me or not, but
little bit.
I am a hardcore inerrantist and I am a creationist, but I'm able to step outside of that and argue from different modes. Right. So if I'm talking to someone who accepts the standard hypothesis of the Big Bang, and that's the origin of the universe, okay, let's set aside the creationism. Let's talk Big Bang. I ain't got to argue someone on the age of the earth. Let's step into what they believe and argue from there. If someone is going to get all twisted up about inerrancy, okay, fine. Let's just argue for sake of argument, that it's not inerrant. Let's just treat it like any other historical documents. Now let's argue from there. And it works either way.
Yeah, and that's essentially the point I was going to make. You have to kind of yield on those topics for the sake of argument and focus on the principles instead. And that's about where I stand now. I tend to be agnostic on the things that I can't sufficiently defend. So things like creationism, I don't even enter that argument because I don't have the wherewithal to defend a position on that. So, I'm perfectly willing to accept whatever view is dangled out there and argue from the principles instead. And, I would say that I'm still an inerrantist, but I'm willing to entertain various ideas on the text because I don't have the wherewithal to defend inerrancy of, say, I don't know, the Jonah story, something like that. Most of the Old Testament, in fact. I have a pretty good defense of the New Testament through and through, but the Old Testament's a little more difficult to defend, just from the standpoint of the facts that we have access to.
If you say so.
All right. I'm not saying it's indefensible. I'm just saying it's difficult.
Yeah. No. I get you. I got picked.
Well, that's a history issue, too. The further back you go on anything, the harder it is to defend.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of corroborating evidence in the first century because we have more things preserved from the first century. Anyway, the next thing I discovered is, like we were talking about, if you want the other guy to listen to you, you have to listen to them. You have to accept that they believe what they believe and then get to the core of those beliefs, which is why I'm a big fan of presuppositional apologetics when it comes to having a conversation on these topics. Which, it circles kind of around to Greg Kokel's tactics because he takes what I would call a pseudo-presuppositional approach in his tactics. You guys know what I'm talking about, right?
I think so.
Okay.
I know what
that's a
presupposition
large
is, and I know
part
tactics.
of my topic.
Okay, great. We're all going to get together at the end. It's all going to tie together with Caleb. Glad we brought you on, Caleb.
I know, right? It just like divine coincidence. I don't know.
Yeah, divine coincidence. Not providence or anything like that.
Right.
So, getting back to my journey, eventually my church asked me to teach a class for college and career age kids or adults. And, naturally I think about going to apologetics because here you have kids who have grown up inside the Christian bubble and they're about to go out into the cruel, cruel world and be challenged in their beliefs. They're going to receive pushback that they haven't gotten before. So apologetics is kind of important because we all know that this is kind of the age that they start walking away from the church. And I wanted to give them some confidence in what they believed. But what should I teach about? I broke it down in my head, and I thought, if I could give these guys one argument, what could it be? Rather than giving them, the entire, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist overview, if I could just kind of dig down and give them one argument they could defend, what should I give them? And I settled on the case for Christ. I did this for several reasons. I did it because, if Jesus claimed to be God and then rose from the dead, there's a pretty strong argument for God's existence right there. You don't have to go back and give the teleological argument or the cosmological argument or anything. If Jesus claimed to be God and rose from the dead, there's some pretty strong evidence. And it's not just God that you defend, it's the Christian God. And furthermore, if you can show that Jesus rose from the dead, you've essentially preached the gospel while you're doing apologetics. And for these kids, give them confidence in Christ's resurrection, gives them confidence in the core of their beliefs. But here's the key for me. If Jesus rose bodily from the dead, then even if you were to adopt evolution and, you give up the inerrancy of Scripture, you still have Christianity. It still exists. And it's true because the core principle that Christ died and rose is still there. I like to say, if Jonah didn't get swallowed by a whale, but Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is still true. Anyway, what does all this have to do with my topic? My topic is intellectual humility, and let me define that for you. Here I'm quoting from the John Templeton Foundation, and here's how they define it. They say that intellectual humility helps us overcome responses to evidence that are self-centered or that outstrip the strength of that evidence. This mindset encourages us to seek out and evaluate ideas and information in such a way that we are less influenced by our own motives and more oriented toward discovery of the truth. When we discuss important controversial issues with others, our initial responses to their arguments tend to be shaped by our preferences, identities, and prior opinions. Intellectual humility buffers against those responses so that we can become more truth-oriented. It helps us overcome our self-centered inclinations in discussion and learning, making us more likely to follow the evidence where it leads and positioning us to be better understanders of the truth. End quote. So, Mark, any of that sound familiar to your topic?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep. All right, so before I jump into what I think of intellectual humility, let me cite some research on the topic. How intelligent do you have to be in order to be intellectually humble? No particular amount. You can be unintelligent so long as you are flexible in your thinking. However, if you aren't particularly flexible, you'd better be pretty smart. Essentially, people who are humble are either smart or flexible. People who are intellectually humble don't have as much trouble saying, I don't know, if they do, in fact, not know. I remember when I used to be a salesman and people would ask me a question about a product or feature that I couldn't answer, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't answer it. I'd do some guesswork and throw a word salad at them, pretend to be knowledgeable, because, they needed me to be confident and informed, or else things would get super awkward. And you see this, right? People have a hard time saying, I don't know, when they do, in fact, not know. So the bottom line is that people with IH, which is what I'm going to call intellectual humility, have a pretty accurate assessment of what they don't know. But sometimes they undervalue or underestimate what they do know. So they don't have as much confidence in their existing knowledge, which sounds like a bad thing. They're willing to admit that they don't know things, but they're not as confident about what they do know. So people with IH aren't particularly afraid to engage in difficult topics. They don't hold tightly to their preconceptions, and they are very curious and interested in learning. All right, so far, how's that sound?
Sounds intriguing. I wouldn't be familiar with it because I don't really come across things that I don't know very often.
Makes sense, and to make a claim from personal experience, it does line up with people I've encountered.
I had a big experience of this just recently. I recently did a series through Easter on contradictions in the Easter accounts. We're studying on Wednesday nights, and there was one. I saved it till last. I kept pushing it back. I was supposed to. This was we spent like 4 or 5 weeks on this, and I came across it, and I was like, man, I got to research that more. I'll address it next week. Next week rolled around. I still hadn't found an answer. I'll have to address that next week. Finally, the very end of the thing, and I'm sitting here left with this alleged contradiction, and I just had to stand up there and go, okay, let me lay this out. Here's the situation. Here's this verse. Here's this verse. And here's some historical context. Here's some ambiguity. Here's what this word might mean. Here's what this word might mean. But I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. Mm-hmm. I cannot find a resolution to this one to say, definitively for sure, here's what it means. Can't be a contradiction.
Yeah. And, if my teacher in high school had told me, I don't know who wrote these books. They've got Samuel's name on them, but couldn't be him, so I don't know. I'd have respected that a lot more than the bull crap that he actually threw at us.
Yeah. It's one thing that's rough is, I do the quarterly question and answer things at my church, and there have been some times, which is one thing that's nice whenever you have a panel of people, because there's times I'm just like, I don't know. Guys, any of you got this? And, someone's able to give some thoughts on it. But, you need to be able to say, I don't know, when you don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the difficulties I would have being a pastor, is that you're the guy up on the stage that everybody's looking at. There's no, panel. There's no team. It's just you up there, and everybody's going to assume that what you say is gospel truth. And that's got to be humbling.
Yeah, it's kind of scary, because it's like, what's weird is having seen the way people talk about and look at ministers and pastors, like we walk on water or something, but we're just human. We make mistakes. We stick our feet in our mouth. There's things we don't know. We misspeak. It happens. But the way I tend to get around it is whenever I'm preaching, I preach to a mirror. I make sure it's a message that I need to be hearing too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, makes sense.
That's really neat to hear your perspective on this, Mark. For the very reason.
Well, one thing that, and this is only kind of related. I remember in college, Baptist student ministry, we were remodeling the building. It was an older building. It hadn't been repainted or recarpeted in decades, probably. And we did that thing end to end. Got carpet donated. Carpet people came by and donated their labor to install it. The director went away, left us the keys to the building, and said whenever he got back, he was just what he had envisioned we were going to do versus what we actually did. We changed a lot of things, and he wasn't a guy that deals well with change. And I had a friend that put a ton of work into this. The director gets back, takes one look around, and goes, "Oh, I don't like it." Well, that just completely shattered her, and she was ticked. She never came back to the Baptist Student Ministry Center. She had nothing good to say about that man or that ministry going forward, because he's a man of God, and a man of God should not act that way. And I'm like, he's just a man.
Yeah.
And this, this has been his office, his position for 12 years, and we just changed the way the whole looked. He's just a man. And I'm rambling now. Someone else talk.
Well, I could circle back around to my topic if that would work. All right. Let me try this. If you were to select an intellectually humble person as your partner in Trivial Pursuit, try to guess. Would you do better or worse at the game?
Better.
Okay.
Better.
All right. And why do you think that is? All right.
Because they're not going to be.
Well,
They're not just going to be, I don't know, just throwing out whatever answer. They're going to, I don't know, try to be sure they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, if they give an answer, it's going to be worth listening to versus, somebody who's going to force an answer on maybe the group. Actually,
I'm going to change my answer. I want the person who's not intellectually humble. Because at least they're going to give some answer, and you know what? Some answer has a chance of being right better, more than no answer has a chance of being right. No answer will always be wrong. Someone who just confidently has no idea what they're talking about but says something, they a broken clock is right twice a day. So
intellectual humbleness is closely associated with things like a desire to learn, curiosity, interest in knowledge. And if you think about it, this idea of being intimidated by things you disagree with, of backing down from engaging in case you disagree with something and it hurts your feelings, if you're an intellectually humble person and you're not afraid of getting your feelings hurt and you're not afraid of knowledge and learning and so forth, and you're open to, engaging with new things that you're not familiar with, then you would tend to be a little more knowledgeable. And intellectual humility tends to be associated with good general knowledge. Now, that doesn't...
You shouldn't have backtracked on me, Mark.
Yeah, well, I was kind of thinking, more of that, intellectually humble attitude in the game. And so that's where I was thinking that. But
it was a fair take.
Yeah.
Go on. Continue schooling me.
That's why you wouldn't want an intellectually humble person in a debate, because they tend to back down on their own confidence. They don't have as much confidence in their current knowledge, and they underestimate their current knowledge because they're so interested in hearing new things and hearing what the other guy has to say. So they wouldn't be great debaters because they lack confidence in their knowledge. But for Trivial Pursuit, they do okay. At any rate, now that we know what the characteristics associated with intellectual humility are, which side do you think is more likely to be intellectually humble? Atheists or Christians?
I don't know that there's necessarily a general answer to that.
Never be afraid to say, I don't know.
I'm gonna base this on personal experience here.
Sure. Always a good thing to base it on.
Right. I say it with a grain of salt. But, in my life, the experience has been that this has fallen to the atheist side, in that I've met far more intellectually humble atheists than I have Christians. But, again, I'm in the South, so...
Well, the thing that I kind of come back to is I don't think, like with a lot of Christians, they'll stand their ground on a dogmatic assertion, but not because they're necessarily standing on the specific assertion, but because they're so sure about God, and that's what they're standing on. They're willing to say, well, okay, I don't know. Right, so something gets said, from the Bible, and someone brings a challenge they haven't heard before, but they're not going to back down because they're standing grounded in God. They may not know. They may even be willing to say, I don't know about that, but I'm trusting God, so I'm standing ground until I have reason to move. Whereas maybe I'm just jaded from trolls, but I haven't come across very many intellectually humble skeptics.
All right, well, let me quote from two different researchers. The first is Craig Boyd. I didn't write down the title, but I'll read the abstract. He says, most criticisms of new atheism are attempts at traditional apologetics. However, Christians who wish to defend the faith against the onslaught of these critics might appeal to virtue epistemology by showing that the new atheists do not possess the necessary habits of thought that a person would need to make a careful and thoughtful consideration of the evidence. In fact, the new atheists fail to practice intellectual humility, and this prevents them from genuine engagement with the strength with the strengths religion offers. What he's trying to say here, he's saying that you have a apologist and a new atheist butt heads, and one way that the apologist might approach this is by saying that the new atheist isn't displaying intellectual humility and therefore may in fact be wrong in their opinions and not know it. So that was Craig Boyd. Now I'll quote a different researcher. This is Elizabeth J. Crumary Mansucio. These are the bullet points from a paper that she wrote. The first point, religion and spirituality were associated with less intellectual humility. Parabolic links emerged between religion, spirituality, and intellectual humility. These links were nearly fully accounted for by right-wing authoritarianism. We have two completely conflicting papers. Oddly, I wasn't able to find any middle ground on the research. So either people can't be intellectually humble on the topic of religion, or the intellectually humble people are all hovering in the middle, not engaging in religious discussions. Now, that seems really unlikely considering willingness to engage and curiosity are both signs of intellectual humility. Mayhaps researchers are a bit biased when it comes to assigning attributes to groups? What do you say, fellas?
No, couldn't be. All researchers are completely unbiased neutral parties that are just seeking truth.
Yeah.
Right?
You're right.
Yeah.
All right.
So, in reality, if we were to take intellectually humble researchers to do this project, then there's potential that they could have bias towards the intellectually humble. So, in essence, this is an experiment that we may never be able to get a firm answer.
Dude, that is so meta.
Well, because the intellectually humble, the intellectually humble, you said they tend to be a little more not as sure in their knowledge, and so researchers, if they're intellectually humble, they're not gonna give any kind of good definitive answer because they probably don't think they have it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, intellectual humility sounds like a very good thing for a researcher to have.
Yeah, but probably not for the person who's proclaiming the data.
Yeah, probably. All right, well, I was able to find a little less bipolar paper titled Intellectual Humility and Reactions to Opinions About Religious Beliefs. The conclusions from this paper weren't a solid, all religious people are closed-minded jerks, nor was it religious people are super humble. The conclusion was that you find both types in a church, which is more or less what you said. The bottom line was that religious people with lower intellectual humility had strong knee-jerk reactions to written material about religion. So these are the guys that share fake news articles they haven't read yet because they like the title, they go ahead and share it, or they unfriend people for sharing articles they don't agree with based solely on the title. So the bottom line of this study was that, predictably, the higher a person's intellectual humility, the less reactive and obstinate they are about views both for or against religion. So it ain't just religious people, it's both.
And I think one thing to also kind of keep in mind, especially if we're going off of our experiences online or whatever, the people who are more likely to be engaging in more confrontational conversations are going to be people who are probably not as intellectually humble. I hate to say that about myself. It's probably true, though.
Yeah, I think you've got a point there. It's hard to balance the two, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, because people who are intellectually humble, are higher, onto that, are probably less likely to, seek out situations where they're butting heads, with people, which is pretty much all social media seems to be nowadays. But, yeah, I don't know.
And there are downsides to intellectual humility, and one is that you're not able to fairly and confidently represent a viewpoint, which occasionally you need. Like, say, in a pastor.
So it's good that I'm not humble. Okay. Nice.
Somehow you'd have to find some middle ground where you're not afraid to say, I don't know, but you are able to, be confident in the things you do know.
Yep.
Well, when they study IH, there are 4 different measures that they use. Sometimes these are related to each other, and sometimes not. But here are the things you may or may not have if you're IH. If there were 5 of them, then I'd do the top 5. But if you are IH, you might have independence of intellect and ego. If you have openness to revising your viewpoint, you might be intellectually humble. If you have respect for others' viewpoints, you might be intellectually humble. And number whatever we're on, a lack of intellectual overconfidence means you're intellectually humble. So what do you say, fellows? Are all 4 of these virtues?
No, I'm kind of hesitant to say they're virtues. They'd make a good comedy routine, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm still trying to just process it.
All right, so the first one is independence of intellect and ego, meaning that you don't tie your self-esteem or your ego to your intellect. I would say that's virtue. I think that if you're relying on your own intelligence to boost or support your ego, then not only are you in for a fall, but you're not really capable of being fair about things.
I concur.
All right, as far as openness to revising your viewpoint, I think that is a virtue if you mean openness versus just revising it at the drop of a hat. You know, you're open to making changes in your view.
I mean, you're actually genuinely wanting to seek truth, but you're not so open-minded your brains are falling out.
Right, yeah, and that's why you have to have some kind of middle ground between complete credulity and intellectual humility.
Right, well, as the great philosopher Aaron Tippett said, you have to stand for something or you'll fall for anything.
Right. Respecting other people's viewpoints.
That was funny.
It's just that I've heard that before, like kind of a lot.
Fine, moving along.
Respect for other people's viewpoints. I don't think that's I don't think that's not a virtue, being respectful of other people's viewpoints.
Caleb, you want to say something? I keep talking. No.
Yeah, I think it is a virtue in the sense that 1 Peter 3:15 indicates that, you know, when we give a defense, we should do so with gentleness and respect. So respect for someone else's viewpoint, I don't think necessarily is not a virtue. It doesn't mean we agree with it, though.
See, I think we need to have, and this is where I think a good point might be made. We don't respect things, we respect persons. So I think we need to have respect for the person, but that person we're acting respecting towards might hold a reprehensible viewpoint that is not deserving of respect at all. And so,
right, I completely agree, and I think our respect, in terms of the way I was phrasing it, in terms of respect for their view, comes from how they've come to that conclusion versus what the actual conclusion is.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, so respect for another person's viewpoint. I think respect isn't necessarily the same as concordance. So, you know, this is the great debate on what tolerance is. Is tolerance embracing another person's viewpoint or just being respectful towards that person? You know, so if phrased that way, that you respect their viewpoint, but you don't necessarily embrace it, I think that that's a virtue. I think that I'd say respecting their viewpoint insofar as here's a person who has thought something out and embraced it and must have some reason for doing so. So you respect them for that reason, but you don't necessarily embrace them. I think you can disagree with somebody but still respect their viewpoint.
Yeah. I mean, well, because the thing is, you just take the most, you know, like extreme, reprehensible example of a viewpoint that you could think of, you know, Third Reich kind of, you know, or something. It's like, no, that viewpoint doesn't, you know, need any respect, whatever. Now, the person holding it, I might treat them, you know, with cordiality, you know, respectfulness, as a, you know, just an image bearer of God. But I feel awkward saying that I should respect their viewpoint.
Well, I don't think that that's a blanket respect for every viewpoint everywhere. But at any rate, we'll skip over the respect thing. A lack of intellectual overconfidence. A lack of overconfidence, I think, is, yes, a virtue, but if it falls down to a lack of intellectual confidence, then you might have a problem.
Agreed.
Yeah, I would agree with that, too.
All right, so those are the 4 points. My bottom line is that I think displaying just a little intellectual humility could make Christianity a little more attractive. And here is why. There are like a bazillion different Christian denominations. I don't think any two of the mentionables belong to the same denomination. Am I wrong about that?
Well, Caleb did say that he's more or less Baptist.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Essentially, I fall in the Baptist range there.
Less than. All right, so how is it that we, the mentionables, are all able to dialogue and disagree and still get along?
You pay us?
That's a good one.
Because we have a centralized goal and perspective that outweighs the differences we share.
Yeah, I agree. So atheists often throw this objection around, right, that Christianity is so divided. How could it possibly be true if none of us agree on everything? I, on the other hand, am very encouraged by this. Why? Because it's clear to me that Christianity, unlike some other religions, allows individuals to pursue their own inquiries and have the freedom to disagree. You know, the ability to disagree is a freedom, in my opinion. We're not forced by our faith to toe some kind of party line. So when I show up at church, everyone has a Bible. They all look at it when the pastor starts reading. And why do we do this? It's because we get to investigate the scripture while the pastor is reading. We aren't just taking his word for it, we're doing our own research. In fact, Bible reading is seen as one of the primary virtues of being a Christian. This is, you pray and read your Bible every day. This is because, it's not because the Bible is some kind of propaganda tract. It's because we can read it and investigate what we read and form our own conclusions. So if we were to display intellectual humility more in the church, we wouldn't be pressing down some kind of authoritarian vice on people, telling them that they have to believe what we believe or go to hell. We have freedom to say, I don't know, and to encourage investigation and to have some dialogue and discussion as peers rather than as superiors and inferiors. So that's what I've got to say. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think one thing, in the church, and certainly not, this is not widespread. There have been those who are like, this is the way it is, and if you believe different, then you're not a real Christian. But generally speaking, even if we don't play well with others all the time, we recognize that you are actually a Christian, even if you've got X, Y, and Z wrong, and that really bugs me. You are a brother in Christ, right? The Bible's pretty clear on several things that where it says, if they cross this line, no longer break bread with them. That they're not to be treated as a brother. And I think that's one thing, maybe from the skeptic's point of view, whenever they're arguing about all these different denominations, that they're just thinking purely ideas. You all disagree, yeah, but look at the things we disagree about, and then look at what the core is, because that's what defines us. So it doesn't matter if you're Baptist or Methodist or Pentecostal or non-denominational or whatever. We can have all these disagreements, but the core thing that actually defines who we are in Christ is the same. And so that's actually where the point is.
Yeah, and that's, circles around to my idea that if you have one argument, it should be Christ.
Yep. Yeah. I have.
You want to do yours?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and to kind of introduce this a little bit, I think this topic goes well last because it really kind of pulls both of these ideas together in a little bit and gives listeners a way of actually practically taking what they've heard today in our conversation and maybe doing something with it. Because, I mean, in the end, that's what this is all about, is what do I do with this? You can use it for personal reflection, but there's lots of things you can use for that. So what can I actually do with this? And that's what I get into. So, to kind of start things off here, when I say the word evangelism, what do you guys think of?
First thing that pops in my mind is some guy out with a Bible on the street yelling at people.
Okay, and for me, it's even a thing in addition to those. It's, somebody handing out tracts door to door, very Mormon-esque in a sense. But, how well do kind of all these methods work?
Haven't used a single one.
Well, one of the things, and this is something that sometimes I struggle with, because it'd be really nice to be the harvester when so often I feel like the sower and the gardener. I personally haven't had too many of those moments of getting to lead someone to the Lord, being the one who's there with them at the moment of, surrender. But I have seen in situations, beach reach, where of lives being changed and hearts being softened and turned towards God. And so I'm rambling. What was the question?
No, what is kind of the effectiveness of this? And I think, Mark, you point to a very important thing here in terms of looking at the parable of the sower and the seed here, is we see something very different, is that, like you mentioned, you haven't had many opportunities to sow or to reap. I haven't either. And I think the view in our country over the last, 50 years has been very much that it's all about reaping. But I think if we were to take on a little more mentality of what can I sow today, or for me even, it's less about sowing than it is about tilling, because there are a lot of rocks in the soil that make it unsowable.
Amen.
So I think that's where apologetics comes in and completely changes the game. But it's not necessarily an easy thing. And so what do we do to make a practical application of this in our lives? Because we can talk about it all day. We can come up with theories as to why this is, and we can wax on about it. But what it really comes down to is, when we look at the scriptures, what do we see? And the gospel doesn't change, despite how popular consensus may feel about it. The gospel doesn't change, nor does the methods demonstrated by Jesus within the gospels. The woman at the well, he doesn't hand her a tract or get up on a soapbox in the middle of the street in Samaria. He asks her questions. He has a personal conversation with her. He relates to what she's going through and asks her questions about that challenge her perspective. And I think this is what we see throughout Jesus' ministry, with, of course, the exception of how he handled the Pharisees in a number of places. And what I think is a key resource for our listeners at this point, if they kind of haven't explored this road yet, to look at, how do we practically share the gospel these days, and what do I do if I'm not that reaper, if I'm not that one who's there with somebody and helping walk them through this moment of realizing the truth. And I think a great resource, and Joel, you already mentioned it already, is Greg Koukl's Tactics. It's a great book, and when faced with the same challenge that you did, and in what do I teach young people in the church, this was the first thing I've went to. I've taught it at our church, in that, this is the course I go to, in that I teach them tactics, because it's about how to have these conversations with people. And it's about how do you utilize the psychology that you know about interactions with people to help them remove rocks from their life. You know, how do you put a stone in their shoe, so to speak, in that it's something they can't stop thinking about? Because in the end, none of the work, the reaping is ours to do. It's God's work, and we are just thankful to be able to be a part of that work.
So you're going to sum up tactics for us right now, aren't you?
That was about as much as I go into it. Try and whet people's appetite, because from anybody who's interested in being able to share their faith, and that should be every Christian. So, you know, I'm not going to go into point by point everything that needs to be done, but I am going to try and give a little bit of a sales pitch as to why this is worthwhile to take this kind of approach with things. So, Joel, if you were to kind of sum up the tactical approach, what's it kind of about?
You mean in tactics?
Yeah, if I had to give you one sentence to explain what it means to be tactical in your approach with people.
One sentence. Well, my one sentence would be to explore their line of reasoning to try to root out the base assumptions they're coming from when they form their views.
And I think that's a great way of describing it, because in essence that is what we're doing. But to unpack that a little bit, I think there's two kind of side pieces there that we have to consider as well. One, when we're going into something like this, we're not going in blind. So we're going in with a game plan. We're going in with something that we have an idea of where it's going, even if we don't know exactly what that's going to be about. And two, I think we want to go in with that component that you know we've talked about in both of these prior topics. We want to go in so that we address people's emotions, so that we address where they're coming from, so that they are open to the intellectual humility that is there and may open them up to a different perspective in the end. So, to kind of make this long story short, what I want to talk about, aside from encouraging people to pick up tactics, give it a read, and kind of see, you know, how you can utilize that in your life, what I want to encourage people to do is take a real practical first step with this. So, you know, your required reading for this would be tactics, but there's a practical way we as Christians can engage in contemporary culture in a relational way. And what I've been doing for the past year and a half at this point is doing surveys. So I'm from a relatively small town, and now I live in a metropolitan area. I think it's second, third, fourth, something like that, biggest city in Virginia. Anyway, in this area, we have a lot of festivals during the summer. So every single weekend from here until the snow starts to fall, we're going to have festivals going on. Now, as a Christian, I want to be able to engage people in a practical way. But I used to knock on doors and hand out tracts. That was one of the earliest churches I was a part of. We went around, knocked on doors, handed out tracts. I never had a meaningful conversation with somebody when doing it. So what I've been doing for the last couple of years is I've taken a cue from tactics and the method that Stand to Reason, Greg Kokel's organization, uses, and I've designed a couple surveys. These surveys are very practical in kind of their questions. They're very open-ended so that it doesn't lead anybody to a certain response. But these surveys give me a way to have a conversation with people that is actively listening to their perspective. Yes, when I'm doing this, I am listening for things maybe contradictory in their viewpoint, but I'm genuinely listening to them as well. So it's not like, oh, gotcha. It's not kind of a game like that. It's developing a relational connection with these people while listening to how they came to the perspective they did. For example, just a few of the kind of questions I have on some of these surveys I give. What is your worldview? How'd you come to that conclusion? How would you describe your core beliefs? Is that, what your worldview actually teaches? Are all
that sounds a lot
worldviews
like street epistemology right there.
It is in a lot of sense, and I think in many ways it predates it. If you go back and listen to some of the conversations Greg Kokel's had about this, it's very interesting to see which came first.
Yeah.
Well, I think an important distinction with street epistemology is, from what I've seen, the videos I've watched, the street epistemologists I've engaged with, it's weird because I don't know that they actually see it. I think some do, which is kind of scary that they would be intentional. But there's almost a manipulative thing going on with street epistemology, where there's just logical fallacies built into what it is, the things they ask and points they're trying to get at through their questions. They ask loaded questions. They're trying to avoid actual reasons and evidence and facts about things. Whereas what sounds to me like what you're talking about, Caleb, is actually just thought-provoking conversation.
Yeah, and that's a very good distinction, Mark, because I think there is a difference there. I'll give you a kind of practical example of things. This past week, just a couple days ago, I've been speaking with one of the New Age churches in our area, the Unity Church. And they hold a New Age festival every year. And I've been trying to get us a booth at this festival.
When you say us,
I mean, I've got a couple other apologists in the area that I work with as well, and so we kind of do these surveys at different festivals in the area. So
you're seeing other apologists, Caleb?
I am seeing other apologists, Joel, but
as you know from
our previous conversation just a few moments ago, as Christians, we are all brothers under a certain belief system, and we have cores to that belief.
Forgive you this time.
Okay, I appreciate that. So, anyway, I've been speaking with this church, and the initial response was, no. We've looked at your websites. To name a couple of, essentially the group I'm with has been a combination of Reasonable Faith chapters and Ratio Christi chapters in the area. And so they looked at some of the websites and said, well, we don't actually believe the Bible literally. We believe it metaphysically. But we don't think you'll be a good fit in this event. So I just asked that they give me a few minutes so I could go in and talk with them and give them one of these surveys that we actually do at these events. Because we may believe one way, that doesn't mean we're there to enforce that view on others. And I think that's largely become the view in culture, is that Christians are here to enforce their viewpoint on us. I mean, anybody who hasn't seen this in the past couple of days with the conversations that have went on with the Alabama abortion bill, must have blinders on. Have you guys seen that?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So in going in and, even though these individuals I spoke with, the coordinator for the event and the pastor for the church, even though they had very, very different views than I do, I was able to listen and hear their perspective on things. And it gave me an opportunity while I was there to actually share what the gospel actually is. And this is an opportunity that doesn't always come up from handing out tracts. At least in my experience, I did not have that when I was knocking on doors and handing out tracts. I had a genuine conversation, listening to their perspective, trying to understand where they were coming from. And because of that, I got an opportunity to share my view as well. And it wasn't forced. I was actually asked what my view was. And I think that is exactly what you're pointing at here, Mark, in a distinction between this and street epistemology. I am not going in with a goal. They asked me repeatedly when I was there, well, what's underlying this? What are you doing after this survey? Are you, trying to get them to come to your church? What's your hidden motive here? And I explained this is not a hidden motive. What you see is what you get. I'm here to learn by listening to your perspective. Doesn't I'm going to agree with it, but I'm going to listen to it. And I'm also here to learn to have this conversation with someone. And that really is the goal, because when I open that relationship door, as you mentioned, Joel, in your research, it showed that relationship is so critical to someone being open to a perspective. Once that door is open, then maybe I do have an opportunity to outright share exactly what the gospel is to me. And even if I don't get to that step, even if I don't get to the point of sowing that seed, maybe some of the questions I get to ask have a chance to remove some rocks from the soil and uproot some of those things that have been present in their life that are holding them back from the gospel. That's what I've seen with the skeptics in my life, is they have a lot of barriers between them and actually hearing the gospel for what is the good news of Jesus Christ. So, that's what it's come to me, and I've seen this method play out time and time again. Do either of you have any kind of experience or thoughts that you want to share at this point about what I've said?
Well, they sometimes talk about how this whole forming relationships type of evangelism is just kind of an excuse to not talk about Christ. And I think that to an extent that might be true, but I've also seen how it's worked. I'm thinking of one gentleman that used to be a boss of mine, and he called himself an atheist. He was pretty bitter towards the church, and it's just because among the reasons he was bitter is because his dad used to be like a deacon or an elder at the local church and then would come home drunk and beat them. And so, that kind of thing would probably put you off. And so it did him, and he had this real bitterness. But in becoming friends with him, and we're close friends, I put a friendly face on Christianity, and I showed that, this whole relationship that he had with his father isn't the end-all and be-all of what Christianity is about. And that's the deal with forming relationships, is that, and this comes from my research about atheists that became Christians, something that was almost universal in every one of the cases I studied, is that at some point they met and befriended a Christian, and that kind of got rid of this negative stereotype, this sort of caricature of Christians that they had in their head prior to that relationship.
I think that raises a really good point, Joel, and I think you laid it out really well. You're giving background information that you've learned from listening to him at this point. You didn't have an ulterior motive in getting to know him. These are genuine relationships you build with people. It's not all about it's actually building a relationship with someone for the same reason that Christ built relationships with people. It's not just about the end goal. It's about everything that gets someone to that point as well.
Yeah, I think that one thing that's always difficult is if it's not a genuine relationship. I have been on the receiving end of being someone's project. And whenever that moment occurs to where it clicks and you realize they're not really my friend, I'm just their mission, that's actually hurtful to be on the experiencing end of that. So there does need to be genuine relationship. But there's always this balance, because I remember I heard someone once explain it. If you picture a relationship like an arc, there's a point, almost like a point of no return, where you keep going on in the relationship and you don't share the gospel. Eventually, it gets to a point to where your lack of sharing it has now confirmed they're okay to not believe, and then hit a point where it's like now they're not going to hear it from you.
I think that's a very good point, Mark. And the way a lot of these surveys are designed, and you can find a couple examples on Stand to Reason's website. If any of our listeners want to reach out, I've got a couple examples of personal ones I've kind of went through and designed as well, is that, are for building that relationship. Many of them end before you get to the point of sharing the gospel, because you realize the conversation is not going to end up there. But they do leave room for that as well. A lot of the final questions on kind of these surveys are, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Or if you could ask a Christian one thing, what would it be? So it leaves room to expand things. Most of my surveys end with questions about Jesus. Who do you say Jesus was? How'd you come to that conclusion? Is that what Jesus says about himself? So it opens these doors to a gospel conversation that somebody may not typically encounter. They may have it preached to them, but they may not actually encounter it. And to give kind of one final example of this and how it really practically played out in doing this, and I think this is a strong example of how this kind of methodology works, and it gives Christians a practical opportunity to get out there. And might I say, what we're doing when we do this, we want our heart to be in that genuine place of where we're listening to people, understanding their stories, and where they're coming from. We pray over this for weeks and weeks, and we do hope that this opens up some doors for people. But we do it in a genuine sense of, we're not there to shove anything down their throat. We're there to listen, and opportunity presents, we're going to give the gospel. And, one example of this, a couple months ago, we went to the Pride Festival here in the city, so the Gay Pride Festival. And
I thought it was some other kind of pride.
Well, I didn't know that the additional explanation was there, and maybe I should add additional abbreviations to that to remain politically correct. But we've went to this event for 2 years in a row now, and we've done these kind of surveys with people. I have somebody else who's went with me who actually did a tolerance survey this go around, and I kind of stuck with the survey of what's people's worldviews, how'd they come to that conclusion, that sort of thing, and spoke with many very interesting individuals who've had diverse spiritual paths in their life as to how they've went away from Christianity for the most part. And I want to add, when we do this in a spirit of love, and we typically hand out water bottles or something too. If nothing else, we've got to show somebody we're there and we care about them as a person. We're not saying we agree with everything they believe, but we can say that we care about them enough as a person that, it's a hot day out there, here, have a bottle of water. During the event, a street preacher came in and set up his, two-step stool and climbed up on it and started yelling things at people that were not exactly the most loving in a sense. They were very judgmental, and don't get me wrong, Christianity can be judgmental. in a sense. I think we are called to judge, but not before we remove the log from our own eye. So anyway, this gentleman showed up with his crew of people, and they had signs, and I hate to put this label on it, but it was very Westboro reminiscence in a lot of ways. And as we were leaving this event, after kind of doing surveys, the police had already kind of moved them outside of the event because things were getting rather violent. And we found this group on one side of the street and another group from the festival on the other side of the street. They were literally yelling back and forth, and the preacher got into a conflict with somebody in the middle of the road that almost came to blows as we kind of got there. And I ended up speaking with the preacher's wife. He wouldn't take the time to actually speak with us and kind of do our surveys or any of that. But I spoke with his wife a little bit, and one of the questions I ended up asking, kind of improvising on the spot, was, why is this methodology the way you see showing kind of the most fruit? And she said, well, we don't necessarily see it showing fruit. At this point, I began to question a little deeper. I said, well, hey, here's what we've been doing. And we've had good conversations with people. It hasn't been perfect. We don't always get to have that gospel communication with people in that conversation. But it's been beneficial. We've built relationships with people and been worthwhile. And her response, of course, was, well, Jesus often rebuked people too.
Jeez.
So my response to that was, yeah, he did rebuke people quite a bit, and it was typically the Pharisees, which caused a moment of silence. But anyway, the point was this conversation was very cordial that we were able to have with this group that was there because, in a sense, we were very much on the same side. But after this conversation wrapped up, we walked across the street and engaged the group who were yelling explicitives back and forth with this street preaching group. And we said, we're actually here doing surveys. We did a survey with them. Would you be interested in kind of talking about your views? And they said, yeah, I'd love to. And we had a conversation there, and it actually was able to lead all the way through a gospel presentation of, here's what the gospel actually is. Not discrediting the group across the street at all, because in one sense they were very much preaching the gospel, but they weren't doing it in a way with gentleness and respect. We were able to share the gospel with a group of 4 or 5 people and explain exactly what the gospel was and why it was good news versus the condemnation that was being spread across the street. And I give all the glory to God in this, is that the situation dissipated, and it really brought an air of peace to the whole area in being able to have that conversation. The police were able to leave, and the whole situation was dissipated by the end, because that's what the gospel does. It brings about peace. And that's the beauty of being able to have this kind of approach. So I encourage people to take time, give Tactics a read, contact us if you're interested in getting one of these surveys we've done here, or check out the ones that are on standtoreason.org and give it a go. Every city has some kind of festival during the year. It's not hard to grab a clipboard, print off a couple surveys, and go out and have a conversation with people. At the very least, even if you don't have a clue what you're doing, you're learning about other people's perspectives, and you're learning how to get out there and to begin those steps in sharing the gospel with others. So, I've kind of rambled on. Any kind of thoughts to add on this, guys? I think it wraps up kind of both of your topics very well in terms of how do we practically apply this stuff.
I have a thought or a question, especially if this is something, as it obviously appears to be, that you're having success with, that fruit is being born from it. The fact is that whenever you start being effective, the enemy fires back. I'm just curious if you have anything to add on the kind of spiritual pushback that someone could expect, or maybe that you have experienced. And I know myself, whenever I've gone into situations, going to do evangelism, I've said before, my first trip to South Padre Island at Beach Reach, as we crossed onto the island, the sense of, for lack of a better word, is just darkness was palpable as we crossed that bridge onto the island. And whenever you go and you start pushing back with the gospel, the enemy tends to come at you. And so one thing I would say, if anyone listening is intending to step out and do something, they need to be aware that there's quite a real thing. I'm just wondering what you may have experienced on that and what your thoughts on that might be.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mark. Last year in particular, and we've experienced this. It's been a part of a much larger group, and only a couple of us have shown up to kind of do this and participate in actively doing this. And I think there's been a big sense of fear placed on people, for one, and it's been placed on me personally. You know, every day when I get up to kind of participate in one of these events, it's a challenge because everything in my emotional state is put against it. And it's not just that. The occurrences in your life get kind of weird around this kind of stuff. To be very, very frank about it, is as these doors open, there are definitely experiences that could easily be written off as coincidence, but when they repeatedly occur in coordination, planning, and actual timing of these kinds of events, it reaches a point where it becomes hard to write off as coincidence.
Yeah, and I know that whenever, and I mean, I know people will want to write it off as coincidence, but if my wife and I are going to get into a fight, it's going to be on a Saturday night or a Sunday morning, right? I mean, if there's going to be something that is, I'm going to throw my thought and my frame of mind and everything off. It's going to happen on a Wednesday night, right? Just this week, knowing that I had this podcast recording coming up. I've got a sermon Sunday. I've got a couple other things that are in the works, and I'm actually really needing to sit down and get some work done on some things for church and for ministry and some other stuff. And in the course of some conversations this week with the abortion stuff going on, someone was able to push my buttons, and I probably reacted in a way I shouldn't have, and that was just a foothold that I allowed the enemy. And I mean, and it has been a spiritual battle for the last 2 days of trying to get my feet back under me to focus on what I need to focus on for the work of the kingdom of God. And that's the kind of thing that if someone's going to step out and do what you do, and or whatever tack that they take that they want to do, that there's going to be some pushback, and it's not going to. This is the weird thing. It typically, as you've said, could be coincidence. People want to write it off. It doesn't come at you head on.
No, no.
Like I said, it's the weird things where it's like I've got a sermon coming up, and I think it's just a good one. This is really good. The church needs to hear it, and then that morning, like getting the kids ready, my wife and I have a blowout. It's like that's a spiritual attack, and that kind of thing. People need to be on guard and praying against that kind of stuff. If you're going to step out there for Christ, expect to take shots.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Mark. 100%.
All right, Joel, say something.
Well, I was going to respond to the various evangelistic tactics that we've talked about. I have training in sales and I have training in counseling. And you ask, how do you get training in sales? Well, you have to go through a lot of seminars and workshops and role-playing exercises to overcome objections and things like that. There's more training in sales than you'd think. And classic sales technique is you create a need and then you fill that need. You see this in commercials where they try to convince you that your life is miserable now because of some problem that you never thought you had, and then they offer a solution to that. and that's sales. Now, with evangelism, you almost end up using that because you have to convince them that there is this problem in their life and that Jesus is the answer to that problem. So the evangelism kind of has a sales technique built into it, even if unintentionally. But in counseling, the thing that you do is to listen. And it works something like this. You get the person talking about whatever it is they want to talk about, and it doesn't have to be any specific subject. You just give them the opportunity to talk, and they'll just kind of wander towards whatever's on their mind. And then as they talk, you make sure they know you're listening to them. So little stuff like, okay, and little head nods and things just encourage them to continue talking. And then the most important thing is that you rephrase what they just said to you. And by doing that, by putting whatever it is that they said to you into your words, they know that you got them. And if you rephrase it in a way that they didn't intend, then they'll come back and clarify. And that just encourages them to talk more. But what I find when I'm talking, say, evangelistically or online, is that as you're clarifying and you ask questions about whatever the assumption that they're coming from or whatever, and as you rephrase, you try to rephrase in such a way as to point out whatever false thinking that they're coming from when they do that. And you would do that in counseling as well, because you want to root out the types of thoughts that they're having which are not helpful to their situation. And when you rephrase and you kind of bring thought out by just kind of making it obvious in your phrasing, they have to then go in and self-correct. Well, the same exact techniques you work very well when you're talking to people who have some kind of objection to Christianity. You listen to what their objection is. You make it certain that they understand you're listening. You rephrase what they're saying in ways that, if you can, kind of pull out the faulty thinking that they're using, and then they have to self-correct. And if you can get a person to come to a realization on their own, rather than you telling them what was wrong, then because the thought came from their mouth and not yours, they're far more likely to embrace that thought.
And what I'm hearing there from that, Joel, is that that's a very honest approach too, in that you're not necessarily going to dive in and say this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. You're letting them recognize that on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do that by rephrasing what they've said. So, and I'll do that so what I hear you say is that the gospel accounts were hundreds of years after Jesus lived. Is that what you're coming from? Is that what you believe? And then, I've actually had them, not hundreds of years. So, that's just kind of a rudimentary example of they raise an objection and you restate the objection back to them, and then they kind of end up having to backtrack on the objection because you didn't answer the objection. You didn't come back and be defensive on it. You just simply rephrased the objection to them.
Right, and that's what I've found has very much influenced my own view over the years, is that I've been asked a lot of similar questions by atheists and skeptics in my life. And a lot of times I haven't had the answers to them. So I've had to go back and research and find out, is there a reasonable answer for this, or am I completely off base? And that's what's shaped a lot of my view in apologetics, is finding answers to this kind of thing. And I hope that it leads to that genuine seeking of truth in other people. There's nothing ungenuine about the approach I'm taking with people. I care about them. I care about the perspective they've come from. But I also care about them seeking truth. So if there is something there in their view that's untrue, I don't hesitate to gently point it out in that way, so that maybe they investigate, maybe they look a little deeper, because the ultimate seeking of truth, if Christianity is true, then the ultimate seeking of truth will lead back to it in every situation.
Okay. Does that wrap you up, Caleb?
That's it for me.
Mark, did you want to come back on that at all?
No. Well said. Good points all around.
All right, so that looks like that's going to close out this episode of The Mentionables. Before we close, I've got a fairly exciting announcement to give. You remember how The Mentionables was this ministry that never asked you guys for money? Well, we've changed that. The Mentionables are now on Patreon. Why are The Mentionables on Patreon? Well, we've got a lot of extra things to bring, but the thing that The Mentionables was always about from the very beginning was the conferences, was going around and speaking. When you're a bunch of penniless apologetics that actually don't connect to a major ministry that has money coming in, the conferences that you end up doing, the speaking that you ended up doing, is practically always at the generosity of others and your own expense. And little known fact, but people who engage in some kind of ministry typically don't have a lot of money to throw around. So,
amen.
But we're not asking for money for nothing. We on Patreon, we've got a lot of cool material prepared. I've been stockpiling extra audio content for a secret Mentionables podcast for patrons only, and what I've been stockpiling are almost entirely debates engaged in by members of the Mentionables, and also we are in the process of recording some audiobooks. The first one is The Mentionables Project. So the Mentionables Project, which if you listen to the podcast at all, you've heard about, has been on kind of a wild ride this week. At the beginning of the week, we started out in the top 300 books on the topic of apologetics and Christian theology. The next day, we jumped up into the top 200. The day following, we jumped up into the top 100. So, for whatever reason, we got a big boost in our rank for approximately a week. Now we're back down in the top 400, so ride's over, boys, but we did get a new review on Amazon, and this is from a fan of yours, Mark.
Would that be Steve? Did they leave a name?
Yeah, Steve.
What did he say?
He said...
I was kind of concerned.
He gave us 5 stars.
Oh, good.
And he said, I met one of the authors, Marc Lambert, last August. We were both students at Frank Turk's Cross-Examine Instruction Academy, and I have considered him a good friend since. Doesn't sound bad so far. So that was my initial interest in seeing the book, but not my reason for this review. I found each author's contribution to the 40 questions to be well thought out, well written, thought-provoking, and maybe more importantly, intellectually honest. I personally find that refreshing. These are questions most likely most, if not all of us, have pondered at one time or another. At least I have. And there was not one cookie-cutter response in the bunch. No Christian cliches, as I refer to them, before I came to Christ at age 30, way back in 87. Way to date yourself there, Steve. Back when Niagara Falls was brand new. Important work, gentlemen. You done good. He put a lot of O's in the good, so.
Oh.
All right. For the sake of balance, I'll read our 2-star review titled, Those Annoying Atheists. An excellent resource for anyone wishing to hone their street epistemology skills. It should be no surprise that Swan's 39 questions elicit in these 5 men the sort of rambling, evasive, and shameless responses one expects to encounter, e.g. to their question, rape wasn't always a crime in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. Is that why do not rape is not in the 10 Commandments? Marc Lambert confidently opines, the 10 Commandments do not include rape because it wouldn't be necessary to say thou shalt not rape. The crime of rape would have been covered under the commandments not to covet and commit adultery, and even the commandment not to steal. Echoing Lambert's heartlessness, Caleb Johnston...
That's me, heartless. Well, hey, that was my whole point, man. Too much emotion. We got to be more logical about things.
Exactly.
Caleb Johnston adds, the last big criticism of Israel conquest, and that the men were allowed to keep virgins for their Canaanite village they seized. This would obviously be rape. Or would it? It doesn't seem like much of an option between these unwanted marriages and death. However, given the Canaanite culture, this may have been a welcome move for these girls into a culture where they possibly had far better treatment. Oh, brother, says the reviewer. He does go on. Well, let's see. I'll jump to the bottom instead of reading through his entire thing.
I remember that was a long review.
Yeah, it sure was. It mentions all of us at one point. That's very flattering. Last paragraph, though. Actually, the questions are not unanswerable. As evidence of that, I would cite Marc Lambert.
Man, they like picking on me.
Yeah. Well, they picked on me and Tyler, but I skipped that part.
Oh, sure, skip yours.
Go figure.
I'll read mine just for fairness. It says, Joel Furchess seems to be the progenitor of this book and the most annoying at having been...
I think we could all agree there.
Inconvenience to think up 39 retorts. Writes in the introduction, the 40 questions were tactical tricks which attempted to disarm and silence the Christian to which they were posed. Well, actually, no, Joel. The purpose is to promote further questioning in order to get one to think about how he thinks. His defensiveness continues when he accuses Swan of taking the reins of the conversation so that they, the atheist, are in charge. Note the subtle yet affecting bias the word atheist asserts into the conversation. And goes on to criticize Tyler. We've done everybody. Let's do Tyler. For his part, Tyler Vela, in his introduction, perceives the questions as attacks on his seriously taken beliefs and charges Swan with poisoning the well for thinking that Exians have not thought about their beliefs until the noble atheist gives them the opportunity to do so. And again, Joel Furchess...
Wait. The guy writes a small book in review, but he has to abbreviate Christian to say.
Yeah, well, that may not be why he did it.
Okay.
I think that, it goes back to the whole Xmas thing, if I had to guess, in that they think it's an insult to add Xmas when the Greek symbol for X was Christos. So you have an X, it means the exact same thing.
I think, though, because it's taken as an insult by people, they use it as an insult.
True. No doubt.
Kind of the way they, make sure to put a lowercase g on God, and they always refer to God as a she, just so they can annoy the Christians.
Yep. New Agers do that too, by the way.
Yeah, but for different reasons.
Right.
All right, well, that's enough. You get the idea. Guy read it to pan it. But he gave us 2 stars, so better than 1 star.
Yeah, that was curious that we actually got 2 stars. But okay, thank you.
Yeah, but we're up to
I'll
4
take
stars because of all the reviews we've gotten. And by all, I mean 4 reviews. But 3 of the 4 were 5-star reviews, so there you go. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is that for patrons, they'll get the audio version of the Mentionables Project, and they might get other versions of the Mentionables Project, joining particular tiers. So let's see, we got the secret podcast, we've got secret forums that only patrons can go on, and some of these forums have the Mentionables themselves as part of the forum, so you'd be able to actually carry on conversations with the team. And one of my favorite, we're going to do a book of the month for a certain where they get an apologetics book mailed to them each month, and not all of them are Mentionables books. And then my favorite is for a higher tier, we're going to do an apologetics crate. So you've heard of these geek crates and other, man crates and all these other products that you can get for a monthly price. Well, with the apologetics crate, you'll get books and audio and video and perhaps T-shirts and things like that related to apologetics in a crate each month. So that's kind of cool. I can't wait to start putting those together and mailing them out. So yeah, that's... paying members will all get free entrance to any of our conferences that we do. So there's also that.
Well, and I think one thing that needs to get mentioned is that the point of any of this is just to pay for the costs that are associated with the things we put together. I mean, none of us are taking home a paycheck from this.
Nope.
That any support given is strictly to support the ministry that Mentionables provides.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. This is not to put in our pocket. This is to cycle back into the ministry. And I mean, the ultimate goal would be to have more conferences and to be able to support things like travel and lodgings, which we've been doing out of pocket so far. And, not all of us are capable of doing that all the time. So whatever is given to the Mentionables is given back to the to the patrons in some way or another, and it also lends to the ministry opportunities we have. So it is a investment in a ministry. It's not just to get stuff.
Yep.
All right, well, that was my long spiel. Make sure to visit us on thementionables.org. Follow us on @Mentionables1 on Twitter. And if you just, search for Mentionables, you'll find our Facebook page.
Among other things.
Yeah, make sure you search Facebook. Definitely don't type Mentionables into Google.
No.
At any rate, maybe we should make that one of our tiers.
If we did come out with our own lingerie line, it would be rather impressive.
The Mentionables.
No, it would be the Mentionables unmentionables.
Oh, there we go.
Well, this is completely off the rails now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. Keep on listening and keep on mentioning.